All right, let's talk about a situation that's just gone from bad to worse. We're looking at a decades-old frontier, one of the most volatile places on the planet, and it has just exploded into open conflict. This is a big deal, a sudden, really dangerous escalation that could totally reshape the entire region. So let's get right into it. So, the big question on everyone's mind is why? And why now? What was the tipping point that took these two neighbors from, a constant simmer of tension to full-blown military clashes? That's exactly what we're going to break down here. Okay, so picture this. It's mid-October 2025. All of a sudden, reports are just flooding in. We're talking artillery, heavy gunfire lighting up the night sky all along that rugged border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And let's be clear, this was no minor skirmish. This was a full-blown, serious confrontation. All right, first up, flashpoint on the frontier. To really get a handle on the stakes here, we've got to get a super clear picture of what exactly went down on the ground during those critical few days. So, here's what we know. The fighting really zeroed in on these crucial border crossings, places like Torkham and Chaman. And the trigger, the spark that lit the whole powder keg? Well, that was a series of Pakistani airstrikes inside Afghanistan. Pakistan's official line was that they were targeting leaders of a militant group called the TTP. Now, the Afghan Taliban didn't wait around. Their response was swift and it was forceful. They launched their own so-called retaliatory operations. The end result? Just chaos. Dozens of casualties reported on both sides, and those vital border crossings, the economic lifelines, were slammed shut. But the battle wasn't just being fought with guns and artillery. Oh no. It was also a full-on information war. Right away, each side started pushing its own version of events. Pakistan was out there framing its actions as, necessary counter-terror operations. Meanwhile, the Taliban government in Afghanistan was calling it a blatant violation of their sovereignty. And with journalists having almost zero independent access to the front lines, figuring out the real numbers, the real truth, it's all lost in the fog of war. But here's the thing. An explosion like this never, ever comes out of nowhere, right? It's always the result of pressure that's been building and building, sometimes for years. So to really understand this flashpoint, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the backstory that got us to this point. And that brings us to our next section, a history of tension. We're about to dig into those long-simmering issues that finally boiled over, and they reveal a really deep and complicated history between these two countries.
Okay, so right at the absolute heart of this whole mess is one group, the TTP. That's the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. Now, this is super important to get straight. They are not the same as the Afghan Taliban, the guys who are actually in charge of Afghanistan. The TTP's main goal, their whole reason for being, is to fight the Pakistani state. And for years, Pakistan has been saying, hey, the Afghan Taliban are giving these guys safe havens across the border. Of course, the Taliban government completely denies this. It's this complicated relationship that's become the central, festering wound between the two countries.
So this timeline really lays out how we got here. It all started to heat up back in 2021 when the Taliban took power in Kabul. Almost overnight, the TTP problem became a much bigger deal for Pakistan. What we saw for the next 4 years was this kind of simmering, low-level friction. Occasional Pakistani strikes, a lot of tension, but nothing huge. But then, in early October 2025, something changed. Pakistan launched a major series of airstrikes. And that, it seems, was the final straw. That's what triggered the massive retaliation we saw just a few days later. Now, a conflict like this is never just contained to one border. It sends shockwaves, geopolitical shockwaves, rippling across the entire region. It changes everything. Political calculations, alliances, you name it. And the fallout, it was immediate. This is hands down the most serious military clash they've had since 2021, and it has absolutely shattered what was already a super fragile relationship. Think about it. When you have artillery flying over populated areas, the risk of some horrible miscalculation that leads to an even bigger war is just terrifyingly high. And we're already seeing both sides dialing up their friends, right? Reaching out to allies like China and the Gulf states, which just ramps up the tension in the whole region. And of course, those same external powers are now scrambling to play mediator and pull everyone back from the edge. But okay, let's move beyond the politics and the military strategy for a second. Because there is a very real, very immediate economic toll, a human cost, to slamming the door on a major international border like this. When you shut down crossings like Torkham and Chaman, you're literally severing a lifeline. We're talking about a complete and total halt to all land trade. Just try to picture it.
Endless lines of trucks, just stuck, going nowhere, loaded with food, fuel, all sorts of consumer goods. And all those local economies that are built around these crossings, the markets, the transit services, they just evaporate overnight. And you can bet that whenever the formal routes close, the informal, and the criminal smuggling networks, are more than ready to step in and fill that gap.
So that leads us to the million-dollar question. What happens next? With the border sealed tight and tensions at a total fever pitch, where does all of this go from here?
Well, from what analysts are saying, there are basically three potential futures here. Let's look at them. First, the best-case scenario. An outside power, maybe Qatar or China, steps in and brokers a deal. The border crossings reopen, and the two sides actually start talking again. Then there's the most probable outcome, a really tense standoff. The border stays shut for weeks, you get sporadic skirmishes here and there, while all the fragile diplomacy happens behind closed doors. And then there's the worst-case scenario. This is a nasty cycle of tit-for-tat strikes that just keeps escalating, leading to a long, drawn-out conflict, massive instability, and of course, forcing tons of civilians to flee their homes.
Because in the end, that's what this all boils down to. For two neighbors locked in such a difficult history, the path forward is a choice. It's a choice between dialogue and disaster. And that choice isn't set in stone. It's going to be made in the coming weeks and months in the halls of power in both Kabul and Islamabad. And everything hinges on whether they can choose that incredibly difficult path of talking to each other, or if they'll go down the truly disastrous road of more conflict.